3 days after I filed one piece of paperwork. An entire neighborhood project worth nearly $250,000 came to a dead stop. Excavators shut down. Contractors packed up. Phone calls started flying. And the man who'd spent months acting like my property already belonged to him ended up standing on my front porch asking for a favor. The strange part is that none of this started with some dramatic confrontation. It started with a few orange survey stakes and a feeling in my gut that something wasn't right. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for 11 years, I owned a small corner lot in a subdivision outside Ashford Ridge, a growing community tucked into the edge of a fast-expanding county. The lot wasn't huge, but it sat in a prime location near the entrance of the neighborhood. I bought it back when property was cheap, and everyone thought the area would take decades to develop. Life happened, plans changed, and I never built anything there. Still, I treated that piece of land like it mattered. I paid the taxes every year without fail. I kept the grass cut. I cleaned up fallen branches after storms. Every now and then I'd walk the property with a cup of coffee and imagine what might eventually go there. Maybe a workshop, maybe a small rental cottage, maybe nothing at all. It wasn't the size of the property that mattered. It was mine. That's why the morning I saw those orange stakes felt so strange. It was a Tuesday in early spring. The kind of morning where everything feels normal before it doesn't. I stepped outside with my coffee and noticed several survey markers lined up along the edge of my lot. At first, I figured the county was doing some utility work nearby. Then I realized something simple. Nobody had contacted me. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had even left a notice on my door. I walked over for a closer look, and while I was standing there trying to make sense of it, my neighbor Linda Foster came jogging down the sidewalk with her golden retriever. Linda was one of those people who somehow knew everything before anyone else did. She slowed down when she saw me staring at the markers. "Oh, so they finally started?" she said casually. I looked at her. "Started what?" She seemed surprised by the question. "The amenity project. I heard the board got approval months ago." My stomach tightened. "What amenity project?" She pointed directly toward my property. The community gathering space. Walking paths, picnic area, landscaping, all that. I remember laughing because I honestly thought she had the wrong lot. Then she said something I'll never forget. "I thought everybody knew they were using this corner. Using this corner. Not buying it. Not negotiating for it. Using it. Like ownership was just some minor detail nobody needed to discuss." Linda realized from my expression that something was wrong. "Wait," she said quietly. They talked like it was already settled. I didn't answer. I just stood there staring at those survey stakes while 100 questions started racing through my head. That evening I dug through old emails from the Homeowners Association. Nothing. No notices. No proposals. No requests. No offers to purchase. Absolutely nothing mentioning my land, which should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me nervous. Because if there really was a project, somebody had intentionally left me out of the conversation. A week later, the HOA held its monthly board meeting. I wasn't a regular attendee. Most people only showed up when they wanted to complain about mailbox colors or parking violations. But that night, I walked into the clubhouse with a folder under my arm and sat through 40 minutes of routine business, waiting for my chance to speak. The board president was a man named Grant Hollow. Mid-50s, expensive watch, expensive truck, the kind of guy who enjoyed being the most important person in a room. He had been on the board for years and seemed to believe the neighborhood functioned because he personally allowed it to. When public comments opened, I stood up. "Can somebody explain why survey stakes appeared on my property?" The room got unusually quiet. Several people exchanged glances. Grant leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Then he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind of smile someone gives when they think they're dealing with a child. "We've been discussing long-term community improvements for years," he said. "That corner lot has always been part of the vision." I blinked. "My corner lot?" "Eventually, yes." His smile widened slightly. "Honestly, Ethan, you should take it as a compliment. Your property is exactly where the neighborhood needs to grow." The room chuckled awkwardly. I didn't. "Have you filed anything with the county involving my parcel?" I asked. For the first time, his expression shifted. Just slightly. But I caught it. Then he shrugged. "Nothing you need to worry about." That answer sat with me all night. Not because of what he said, because of how he said it. Confident people answer direct questions directly. People hiding something usually don't. The next morning, I took a personal day from work and drove straight to the county records office. I expected to spend maybe an hour confirming that everything was some misunderstanding. Instead, I walked into a situation that would consume the next several months of my life. By lunchtime, I was staring at documents that made my hands shake. There it was. A development application filed 4 months earlier. Detailed plans, engineering notes, budget estimates, contractor approvals, and buried inside the paperwork was my parcel number. Not listed as privately owned property. Not identified as a future acquisition target. Listed as dedicated community space. As if ownership had already been settled. As if my name didn't exist. As if someone had quietly erased me from the equation months ago. And the deeper I looked, the worse it got. The first thing I did was read the application again because I genuinely thought I had to be misunderstanding something. People don't just accidentally claim land they don't own on government paperwork, especially not an organization with attorneys, accountants, and a board full of people who supposedly understand property rights. But the more pages I reviewed, the more obvious it became that this wasn't a clerical mistake. Somebody had built an entire project around the assumption that my lot would eventually belong to the HOA, and somewhere along the way they had stopped treating that assumption like a future possibility and started treating it like an established fact. What really got under my skin wasn't the paperwork itself. It was the timeline. The application had been submitted 4 months earlier. Engineering reviews had already been completed. Site plans had been approved. Contractors had been selected. Funding had been allocated. Meetings had been held. Discussions had happened. Votes had been taken. Meanwhile, I was out there mowing the grass every other weekend, completely unaware that people were sitting around conference tables discussing what they planned to build on land they didn't own. I spent nearly 3 hours at the records office copying documents and taking notes. On my way home, I called my friend Marcus Hale. Marcus wasn't a lawyer, but he had spent 20 years working in commercial construction and knew more about permits and development than anyone I knew. That evening, I spread the paperwork across my dining room table and watched his face change as he flipped through the pages. At first, he looked confused, then concerned, then impressed in a way that wasn't positive. Finally, he set everything down and leaned back in his chair. "Ethan," he said, "either these people are incredibly stupid or they're so used to getting their way they stopped checking whether they actually could." I laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. "Which one do you think it is?" He didn't hesitate. "Second one." That answer stayed with me, because once I started thinking about it, Grant Hollow had spent years building influence inside the neighborhood. New residents liked him because he always seemed confident. Older residents trusted him because he'd been around forever. Contractors knew him. County staff recognized his name. Most people never challenged him because he always sounded like he already knew the answer. And maybe that was the problem. Sometimes people who spend too long in positions of authority begin treating resistance like a technicality. The following week, I started talking quietly with neighbors. Not gossiping, not accusing anyone of wrongdoing, just asking questions. What I learned painted a much clearer picture. Apparently, the board had been discussing the amenity project for nearly 2 years. They wanted a centerpiece for the neighborhood. Walking paths, decorative landscaping, a picnic pavilion, community gathering areas. On paper, it sounded nice. The problem was that the most attractive location happened to be my corner lot. Instead of approaching me directly, they kept treating ownership as a future obstacle they would eventually solve. Then at some point, they stopped talking about acquiring the property and started talking about using it. One conversation became another. One assumption became another. Before long, everyone inside the project was operating under the belief that the land issue would somehow magically work itself out. The more I learned, the angrier I became. Not because they wanted the property. Anybody can make an offer. Anybody can negotiate. What bothered me was the arrogance. The quiet belief that my participation wasn't necessary. Like I was a minor inconvenience standing in the way of their plans. About 10 days later, I hired an attorney named Rebecca Sloan. Rebecca had a reputation for being calm, methodical, and absolutely relentless when property rights were involved. During our first meeting, she spent nearly an hour reviewing every document I collected. Unlike me, she never appeared shocked. She simply kept turning pages and taking notes. Finally, she looked up and asked one question. Do you want compensation? Or do you want control? I remember pausing because nobody had framed it that way before. Then I answered honestly. I want my property. She nodded once. Good. That's simpler. Over the next several days, Rebecca conducted her own investigation. The results were even worse than what I'd already found. The contractor had begun preliminary site work based on the approved plans. Equipment schedules were locked in. Material deliveries were being coordinated. Financial commitments had already been made. The project budget had grown to nearly $230,000. In other words, this wasn't just a proposal anymore. It was a machine already moving forward. And every day it moved forward increased the pressure on me to simply step aside. That's when Rebecca explained something that changed everything. Under state law, when ownership of a parcel connected to an active development becomes formally disputed, regulatory agencies are often required to suspend approvals until the ownership issue is resolved. I stared at her for a moment. You mean if we file a dispute? She finished the sentence for me. The project stops. For the first time since finding the documents, I felt something other than frustration. I felt hope, not revenge, not excitement, just relief. Because up until that moment, it felt like I was chasing a train that had already left the station. Suddenly, there was a break. The paperwork took several days to prepare. During that time, construction activity continued. Every morning, I drove past workers marking utility paths and staging equipment near the project area. Every afternoon, I felt my blood pressure rise. Nobody from the HOA contacted me. Nobody apologized. Nobody attempted to negotiate. Their silence almost seemed strategic, as though acknowledging the problem might somehow make it real. Then Friday afternoon, Rebecca called. We're ready. The title dispute notice was filed before close of business. Official copies were delivered to the appropriate county offices. Additional notifications went out to planning administrators and permit reviewers. Legally speaking, it wasn't dramatic. No courtroom, no shouting, no television cameras, just paperwork. Yet somehow that stack of paper carried more power than every survey stake, committee meeting, and construction schedule combined. The weekend that followed felt strangely quiet. I spent most of Saturday working in my garage, trying not to obsess over what would happen Monday morning. Every few hours, I checked my phone. Nothing. No emails. No calls. No angry messages from a board. By Sunday evening, I began wondering whether we'd overestimated the impact of the filing. Maybe the county would take weeks to respond. Maybe nothing would happen at all. Then Monday arrived. Around 9 in the morning, Rebecca called. Her voice was calm, but I could hear satisfaction underneath it. The suspension order was issued. I stopped what I was doing. Already. For a second, I didn't know what to say. 11 years of ownership. Months of planning behind my back. Weeks of investigation. And now the entire project had slammed into a legal wall because someone finally forced reality into the conversation. Around noon, I heard something unusual. Nothing. The construction equipment that had been operating for days simply stopped. No engines. No backup alarms. No workers shouting instructions. Just silence. I walked onto my back porch and listened. It may sound strange, but that silence felt incredible. Not because somebody was losing money. Not because a project was failing. Because for the first time since this started, the facts mattered more than the assumptions. Ownership mattered. Reality mattered. My rights mattered. A few hours later, just after 3 o'clock, there was a knock at my front door. I already knew who it was before I opened it. When I opened the door, Grant Hollow was standing there alone. No board members. No attorney. No confidentes might. Just Grant. For a moment, neither of us said anything. It struck me how different he looked from the man sitting at the head table during those HOA meetings. Back then, he always seemed larger somehow, protected by the title, the audience, the authority he had built around himself. Standing on my porch, though, he was just another guy who suddenly had a problem he couldn't talk his way out of. Can we talk? He asked. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. Depends what we're talking about. He glanced toward the street before answering. The project. I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. For months, nobody had felt the need to talk to me. The second the project stopped, suddenly communication became very important. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. Things got more complicated than they should have. That's an interesting way to describe claiming someone else's property. He winced slightly. Nobody was trying to steal your land. Really? I asked. Because the county records tell a different story. For several seconds, he didn't respond. Then he sighed. The board assumed we'd eventually reach an agreement. You never asked. We thought there would be time. You had 2 years. That landed harder than I expected. He looked away. The truth was simple, and neither of us could avoid it anymore. The board had convinced itself that ownership was just a detail. They became so focused on the project, they stopped seeing the person standing between them and the outcome they wanted. Grant wasn't a criminal mastermind. He wasn't some evil villain sitting in a dark room plotting to take my property. In some ways, that made the situation worse. This happened because a group of people gradually became comfortable ignoring boundaries. One assumption led to another until common sense disappeared entirely. Our conversation lasted nearly 40 minutes. By the end of it, the message was clear. The HOA wanted the dispute resolved immediately. Contractors were demanding answers. Residents were asking questions. Budgets were unraveling. The suspension order had created panic because suddenly everybody involved had to explain why a privately owned parcel had been presented as community property. Before leaving, Grant asked a question that still sticks with me. What do you want? The answer came easily. Exactly what I've had for 11 years. My property. He nodded slowly. For the first time since this started, I think he finally understood. Not everything is for sale. Not every obstacle can be negotiated away. Some things belong to people because they earned them, maintained them, and protected them. The following 2 weeks moved quickly. Attorneys exchanged documents. County officials reviewed corrections. Emergency board meetings were held. Residents demanded explanations. The deeper people looked, the harder it became for the HOA leadership to defend what happened. Eventually, a settlement was reached. The board formally removed my parcel from every development plan. The HOA agreed to reimburse $4,000 in legal expenses. More importantly, a permanent deed confirmation was recorded with the county, creating a clear public record that left absolutely no room for future confusion. Rebecca called me the day everything became official. Congratulations, she said. It's over. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and drove past the property that evening. The survey stakes were gone. Every single one. The corner lot looked exactly the way it had looked before this entire mess started. Grass moving in the wind. A few birds hopping around near the fence line. Nothing dramatic. Nothing special. Yet somehow it felt different. Maybe because I understood something now that I hadn't understood before. Ownership isn't just about paperwork. It's about vigilance. Most people assume rights protect themselves. The truth is rights survive because ordinary people are willing to defend them when necessary. Over the next several months, the fallout continued. Residents became increasingly frustrated after learning how much money had been wasted. Questions turned into investigations. Investigations turned into elections. By the end of the year, every board member who had approved the project was gone. Some resigned voluntarily. Others were voted out. Grant disappeared from community leadership altogether. The new board spent months rebuilding trust and cleaning up the damage left behind. A few neighbors later told me they felt sorry for Grant. Oddly enough, part of me did too. Not because he deserved sympathy for what happened, but because I think he genuinely convinced himself he was acting in the community's best interest. The problem is that good intentions become dangerous when people start believing the rules apply differently to them. Looking back, there was one moment that taught me more than anything else. It wasn't finding the paperwork. It wasn't filing the dispute. It wasn't even watching the project shut down. It was standing on my porch while Grant asked what I wanted. Because buried inside that question was the assumption that everybody has a price. That eventually people will surrender what's theirs if enough pressure is applied. And maybe that's true sometimes, but not always. 11 years earlier, I bought a small corner lot. 11 years later, I ended up defending something much bigger than a piece of property. I defended the simple idea that ownership still means something. That words on a deed matter. That powerful people don't get to rewrite reality because doing so would be more convenient. These days, I still drive past that lot from time to time. I still mow it. I still pay taxes on it. I still haven't decided what I'll eventually build there. Maybe a workshop, maybe a guest house, maybe nothing at all. And honestly, that's the best part. The choice remains mine. But here's the question that still sparks arguments whenever I tell this story. Was the HOA completely wrong for planning something that might have benefited the neighborhood? Or was there a real mistake assuming the end result mattered more than the owner's consent? I'd genuinely like to know what you think. If you were in my position, would you have stopped the entire project? Or would you have tried negotiating a deal? And if you were one of the residents hoping for that new community space, would you blame the board or the property owner? Let me know down in the comments, because these situations are never as simple as people think. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's dealt with HOA drama, property disputes, or neighbors who forgot where the boundaries were. And remember, sometimes the most powerful thing you can own isn't land, money, or influence. It's the willingness to stand your ground when everyone else expects you to move.